Okay, well, last week we introduced the book of Daniel, did some overview and some historical background. We saw that the first 6 chapters were made up of several events that are very familiar to us in the life of Daniel and his friends during this period that we call the Babylonian captivity, this time when Judah was taken captive by the Babylonians. And then the last 6 chapters are prophetic writings. We talked about how God gave the Israelites laws to keep, and he promised blessings if they kept those laws. They would have plenty of food, safety, they would have victory in battle. But if they disobeyed, God would bring about plagues, failed crops, and other disasters. Well, God continued in his patience with them by sending prophets to warn them. But the people did not listen, so the punishments became increasingly worse. Finally, God appointed their enemy, the Babylonians, under King Nebuchadnezzar, to conquer them and carry them out of the promised land and into Babylon. God said Nebuchadnezzar was his servant to execute punishment and judgment on Judah for their idol worship and disobedience. The Israelites would remain in Babylon for 70 years. The time in Babylon was not an arbitrary number. God had commanded the people to observe a Sabbath year every 7th year. It was to be a year of rest for the ground and a time for the people to trust God to provide for them. The people ignored this command for 490 years. That is, there were 70 Sabbaths that were missed. So God sent them into exile for 70 years, and the land enjoyed its Sabbath. And through all of this, we see that God is sovereign. And this is the theme of the book of Daniel. God is sovereign over creation. He's sovereign over kings. He's sovereign over history. We saw this last week as we saw how God moved empires and events to accomplish his purposes. Well, let's just do a little reminder of the timeline we looked at last week. We talked about King Josiah being a good king and ushering in some reforms, but then the last 4 kings after him were all bad. It seems like one was worse than the one before him. And so as a result, Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon attacked Jerusalem 3 different times, first in 605 BC, and at that first attack, that's when Daniel was taken captive and moved over to Babylon with his 3 friends. And then a second time, Nebuchadnezzar attacked in 597. This is right at the end of Jehoiachin's reign. And then there was one third attack, one final attack, and at that point, it was the fall of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar just destroyed the city and led into the Babylonian captivity. So Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC. So that's kind of our timeline. So as we begin in Daniel, we're at the beginning of this period. We're like in 605 BC after Nebuchadnezzar's initial attack. And then just a review of the map that we looked at so we kind of remember where it is we're talking about. That light green area, the kind of curved around there, that's the Babylonian Empire. The Medes and Persians are above them, to the north of them, and then going out farther, extending out to the east. Lydia over in what we now call Turkey. Egypt is still there, but they've retreated, and really at this time Babylon is the dominant empire in the world. Greece hasn't formed yet. There's still some city-states over there. Rome is a long way from coming into empire status. So this is sort of the lay of the land, if you will. And then one other thing to note is you can see the red line that runs from Jerusalem up and around and over to Babylon. That's the route that Nebuchadnezzar and the Jews took back to Babylon, because they can't cut straight across because that's through the Arabian desert. So they had to go and make the big loop. Going straight across from Jerusalem to Babylon is about 500 miles, but if you have to make the loop up and around, it's more like 900 miles. Probably took about 4 months to make the journey. So that's kind of where we're at on the map and time frame. Okay, so let's take a look at these first verses as Daniel opens up. I'll read verses 1 through 8, and if you would just jot down any important words or phrases, we'll do that and write them down as our overview for our lesson tonight. It's Daniel 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. Okay, so what words jumped out to you as important words there in that section?
Defile himself.
Defile himself.
Actually, not defiled himself, yeah. Okay,
Not defile.
yeah.
I think that's Lynn. I haven't heard the mysterious voice.
It was resolved.
King? Nebuchadnezzar.
Yep.
In my Bible, Oxford United Schofield Study Bible, the word is qualified.
Qualified. Yeah. Yeah, good.
And then another word is resolve.
Resolved, yeah.
Educated for 3 years. Is that what it said?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, that gives a good overview of where we're heading. Well, there's one more bit of background that we didn't get to last week, but it's worth covering, worth remembering as we talk about Babylon. We're first introduced to Babylon in the form of the city of Babel, or Babel, depending on how you pronounce it. And we see this in Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 through 10, if somebody would read that.
Cush, father of Nimrod, he was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar.
So this mighty man, Nimrod, and what was how did that begin? He was the son of
Cush.
Son of Cush. Okay. So we're early on, not too long after the flood, and he's establishing this kingdom. So that's where we first see about the city of Babel that he creates. Well, then In chapter 11, we read about the tower that men built there in Babel as they were attempting to reach the heavens. And so that's in Genesis 11, 1 through 9.
Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bomb them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth.
We make this connection here because Babel sounds a lot like the Hebrew word for confusion, and that's where they come up with that tie there to confusion that John just read. So there are a couple things happening here in Babel at this time. First of all, the people are trying to usurp God. They're trying to take God's place. They wanted to build this tower that would go to heaven. They wanted to become like God. And the second thing was that they were deliberately disobeying God's command that he had given to man to multiply and spread throughout the earth. And that's in Genesis 9, verse 1.
And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth."
So that was the command God gave to Noah after the flood, was to go out and fill the earth. And this group of people decided, "Oh, we don't want to do that. We're not going to go anywhere. We're going to stay here. We're going to build a tower here. We're going to be our own God, and we're going to live our lives here." So that plus their other disobedience, God confused the language there, and that forced people apart. He spread them apart at that point. So rather than, well, back up. They all spoke one language, and then God confused their language, so they had different languages and dispersed them. And some of the people stayed in that area and became known as Chaldeans, and these are the predecessors of what we see here in Daniel, these Babylonians. So we see in the past, this grew into Babylon, but we also see Babylon in the future. In the book of Revelation, John sees a vision of Babylon, and that's Revelation 17:5.
Another forehead name was written a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth.
So here we see that this ancient Babylon was a source of the false and idolatrous religions that spread throughout the earth. So at this point, Babylon becomes a symbol of the world system that is opposed to God. And that's often generally how it's portrayed in Revelation. Pastor Tony Garland made the following observation. He said, "In the record of Babel, as minimal as it is, we see the first human king and kingdom in direct rebellion to the commands of God, resulting in judgment. In Babylon of the end, we see the last human king and kingdom in ultimate rebellion to the commands of God, resulting in the final judgment of all human kingdoms to be replaced by the millennial kingdom ruled by the Messiah." So there is a thread of this Babylon running from Genesis all the way through to Revelation. And we see this one particular aspect of it as an earthly kingdom here in Daniel's time. Well, in verse 1 of chapter 1, we see the timing of these events. It's in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim's reign. This is the year 605 BC. Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Assyrians and Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish. We talked about this last week. In that year of 605. Jeremiah talked about this in Jeremiah 46, verse 2.
Concerning Egypt, this is the message against the army of Pharaoh, Necho, king of Egypt, which was defeated at Carchemish on the Euphrates River by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah.
So this Battle of Carchemish was the final blow to the Assyrian Empire that officially ended Assyria, and it also sent the Egyptians retreating back to Egypt. They had kind of been up in this region of Israel and been trying to exercise their influence, but this sent them back. Well, the Babylonians have been a growing force in the region, but now they're the premier empire in the world as of 605. So Nebuchadnezzar then turns his attention to the south, toward Jerusalem, because there have been a lot of rumblings and troublemakers there in Judah, and he decides that he's going to lay siege to them. He takes away some of the people and the treasures from the temple, and we read about that in 2 Chronicles 36, 6 and 7.
Against him came up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and bound him in chains to take him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried part of the vessels of the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in the palace in Babylon.
So that's what's happening here in the first verses of Daniel, is that action of Babylon, or of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon against Jerusalem. Now, there's a lot going on in this year of 605. There's the Battle of Carchemish. There is Nebuchadnezzar coming down to Jerusalem. And then also at this time, Nebuchadnezzar's father, the king, Nabopolassar, dies back in Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar wasn't officially king yet. He's the crown prince, the lead general. And when Nabopolassar dies, Nebuchadnezzar returns back to Babylon to be crowned king. So we see here, if you may have noticed a couple of different things. We have here in Daniel saying it's the 3rd year of Jehoiakim. Well, Daniel uses the Babylonian method of reckoning a king's reign. They didn't count the year the king ascended to the throne as his first year of being king. On the other hand, what we read in Jeremiah said it was the 4th year of Jehoiakim. Well, the Jews, they would count the day the king took the throne as his first year. And so that's why one says the 3rd year and the other says the 4th year. They're in agreement. They're just using different systems of recognizing that. So we see that Jeremiah says these things happened in the 4th year of Jehoiakim's reign. And let's read about that. Somebody has Jeremiah 25, 1 through 11, but you may want to turn there and follow along. It's a little longer passage because it describes not only that, but it also talks about, kind of summarizes God's dealing with Judah. So let's go ahead and read that passage, Jeremiah 25, 1 to 11.
This message for all the people of Judah came to Jeremiah from the Lord during the 4th year of Jehoiakim's reign over Judah. This was the year when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon began his reign. Jeremiah the prophet said to the people in Judah and Jerusalem, for the past 23 years, from the 13th year of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah, until now, the Lord has been giving me his messages. I have faithfully passed them on to you, but you have not listened. Again and again, the Lord has sent you his prophets. You have not listened or even tried to hear. Each time the message was this: turn from the evil road you are traveling and from the evil things you are doing. Only then will I let you live in this land that the Lord gave to you and your ancestors forever. Do not make me angry by worshiping the idols you have made. Then I will not harm you. But you would not listen to me, says the Lord. You made me furious by worshiping your idols, bringing on yourselves all the disasters you now suffer. And now, the Lord Almighty says, because you have not listened to me, I will gather together all the armies of the north under King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, whom I have appointed as my deputy. I will bring them all against this land and its people, and against the other nations near you. I will completely destroy you and make you an object of horror and contempt and a ruin forever. I will take away your happy singing and laughter. Joyful voices of bridegrooms and brides will no longer be heard. Your businesses will fail, and all your homes will stand silent and dark. This entire land will become a desolate wasteland. Israel and her neighboring lands will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years.
The ESV says that Nebuchadnezzar is God's servant. And there, what version was that, John? That said, called him his deputy. Is that NIV or?
NLT.
Okay.
Living Translation.
Okay, yeah. But same kind of idea, right? That it's clear who's in charge. So then we see that in verse 1, back in Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the city, so he encircles it with his troops. Jehoiakim surrenders. No doubt Nebuchadnezzar was proud of his brilliant military strategy, but verse 2 tells us what really happened. God gave Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Judah had been pursuing idols for generations, so God gave them what they wanted. They were able to go into this land with a lot of idols. Well, things looked bleak for Judah, but God was in control, using his servant Nebuchadnezzar to bring about his purposes. And again, here we see our theme of Daniel, that God is sovereign. And we see this also in Psalm 20, verses 6 through 8.
Now this I know, the Lord gives victory to his anointed. He answers him from his heavenly sanctuary with the victorious power of his right hand. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. They are brought to their knees and fall, but we rise up and stand firm.
So Nebuchadnezzar may have been trusting in his horses and chariots, but it was God's hand that brought this about. God's discipline of Judah was to bring them to repentance. It was to prepare them for the day that he would deliver them from captivity. God's ultimate purpose was redemptive. Well, then we read that the vessels were taken to Babylon, where they were deposited in the treasury of the temple.
Okay, we just.
I'm sorry? Was there a question? Or?
I think that was
Lynn.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I forgot my thing was off.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I was
All
talking to my dog, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So Nebuchadnezzar takes these to the temple of his god Bel-Merodach, or one of his other gods. And we'll read about these temple vessels later in Daniel when we see King Belshazzar brings them out for that final feast that he has. And there was the case of the handwriting on the wall. So we're gonna read about these temple vessels again in our study in Daniel a little later on. Well, verse 2 refers to Nebuchadnezzar taking them to the land of Shinar. This is just another name for that area of Babylon or Chaldea. They're used interchangeably here. The first two verses of Daniel are the fulfillment of the prophecy recorded by Moses when God was giving the law through him. Deuteronomy 28, 49 through 52.
The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like the eagle, a nation whose language you do not understand, a hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. It shall eat the offspring of your cattle and the fruit of your ground until you are destroyed. It also shall not leave you grain, wine, or oil, the increase of your herds or the young of your flock, until they have caused you to perish. They shall besiege you in all your towns until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout all your land. And they shall besiege you in all your towns throughout all your land, which the Lord your God has given you.
So God spoke through Moses, if the people were to disobey the law, what would happen to them. It was a pretty clear description of what ends up happening. So we also see in these first two verses of Daniel that there's a fulfillment of the words that were spoken by Isaiah to King Hezekiah. And this is in 2 Kings 20, 16 to 18.
And Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons, who shall be born to you, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon.
So this prophecy that Isaiah gives to Hezekiah, if you'll recall that story, Hezekiah prayed to be healed, and God granted him an extension of his life. But then he proudly went and showed off his treasures to the other king, neighboring king, and against what God had told him to do. So as a punishment, Isaiah comes and speaks these words to Hezekiah about 100 years before where we are right now with Daniel. Well, not only would God bring punishment on Judah, but he said it would be done by the Babylonians, and that some of the Jews would be officials in Babylon, and that's exactly what we see happening here. Well, Nebuchadnezzar has not completely overrun Judah at this point. As we said, it's just his first incursion against Judah. He's appointed a king there, and this king is going to be like a vassal king. He's going to continue to have some nominal powers, but he's going to pay tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. So to keep things in check here, Nebuchadnezzar takes some of the royal family with him. So the existing king in Jerusalem is not going to get too out of hand, because Nebuchadnezzar has some of his family tucked away in Babylon now. Last week, we talked about coming to Babylon, and we did that virtual tour of the Pergamon Museum, and we saw the replica of the Ishtar Gate and that road that led up to it, the road that was called May the Enemy Not Prevail. And the one thing that we missed, though, in that was getting some perspective, because there really wasn't anything there to judge that. So I'll just review with a couple of quick pictures here. So here's a picture of that gate, and now you get a better idea of the size of it when you see the people that are there. And that we viewed that on our walkthrough tour last week. And then one more to kind of give you some perspective on the wall. That's my oldest daughter and I are standing up there, so you can kind of get an idea of that lower level of animals there, just how high up that is, or how low to the ground that is compared to the height of the wall. So that was the intimidating factor that Daniel and his friends are walking into as they approach Jerusalem. In verse 3, it says that King Nebuchadnezzar is looking for the best and brightest young men of Judah. He doesn't want just masses of prisoners. Sometimes in these ancient wars, they would just bring everybody in huge numbers to make them slaves. Here, Nebuchadnezzar is taking a different approach. He's not just looking for slaves to go and pound rocks. He wants people that are going to be of value to him in his kingdom. So he looks for the best and the brightest. He wants to leverage their abilities to further his kingdom. The historian Josephus claimed that these young men were related to the future king Zedekiah. Whether they were or not, they were clearly part of the upper class within Jerusalem, part of either the royalty or the nobility around the king. Nebuchadnezzar wanted young men who were good-looking, intelligent, and without defect for the purpose of entering into the king's service. He wanted young men so that the investment he makes in them will have time to pay off throughout the years as they live their lives in the kingdom. Now, we don't know exactly how old these young men were when they come. Some commentators think they were 18 to 20. Others say they're 12 to 14. Let's just say they were teenagers. They were in that age group. So think about the teenagers you know or have known and think of them being in this situation. And we see that Daniel and his friends really have a remarkable response to all that's going on around them. We do know that they are old enough that they've demonstrated some ability. They've been able to, they've been at the top of the class, we might say. They're the star students. They've shown some ability. And Nebuchadnezzar wants to recognize that promise and build on it. Well, it tells us that Ashpenaz is assigned the task of selecting the young men and then delivering them to Babylon. He's described as the chief eunuch, but this word eunuch here, it can literally mean a eunuch, but it's often also translated as a chamberlain or a palace official. So it may just be that he's an official in the palace. The point is, he has a high position in the king's court. The young men were to be given special treatment and instruction. We might say they would have a college scholarship on a full-ride scholarship, or a college education on a full-ride scholarship. They would learn all the knowledge of Babylon, including astronomy, literature, and language. But their instruction would also include astronomy and magical arts, so there would be a dark side to what they learn. This was not like the slavery that the Jews encountered in Egypt, where they were forced to make bricks or they would be beaten. No, this is enticing these young men with an education, with good food, being around the king's court, and really presented a bright future to them. Yes, they were taken away from their land. Yes, they were ripped away from their homes, but the treatment by the king really could mean, in an earthly sense, a bright future. If they applied themselves to their studies, they would have positions of power and lives of comfort in this new land. There were some promising aspects to their new situation, but their faith would be challenged through this process. Verse 5 tells us that they would eat the same food the king ate. Imagine that, getting to eat the same food the king eats. They'd be well cared for. The studies and indoctrination would go on for 3 years. At the end of that period, they would stand before the king for inspection. They would then be assigned tasks in the kingdom based on how they performed. But these 3 years would come with many challenges to these young men. It begins right off the bat. The first assault on these young Jews is in verse 6. These youths from the tribe of Judah were given new names by Ashpenaz. He found their current names distasteful and an affront to his gods. This change is particularly difficult when we consider the meaning of their given names versus their new names. So let's take a look at what they were. First, Daniel, and again, these meanings are approximate, especially the Babylonian ones. There are a couple of variations on them. But Daniel's given name means God is my judge. And Ashpenaz changed that name to Belteshazzar, which means Bel's prince or Bel's servants. That's one of their gods. The second young man, Hananiah, means Yahweh is gracious. And he changed his name to Shadrach, which is a reference to the sun god Shad, or servant of Shad. The third young man was Mishael, and that name means who is what God is. And that's just a way of asking, saying how great God is. Who is like God? And he changed his name to Meshach, who is like Shak. Again, Shak is their name for Venus, their goddess of love. And then the fourth young man, Azariah, Yahweh is my helper. And they changed his name to Abednego, servant of Nego. So their given names speak of God's judgment, his graciousness, his greatness, his provision, the provision of the one true God. The new Babylonian names were to worship their false gods and satanic practices. The given names reveal monotheism. Their new names speak of polytheism. Their given names were a dedication to the Lord. Their new names were in dedication to the false gods of the Babylonians. So by giving them new names, this is the first attempt to break and remold these young men into a Babylonian image. Their names were changed to try to help them forget their country, their faith, and their God. Well, let's bring this a little more current and maybe have a little discussion around a question here. Let's think about our lives today. What are some ways that we see the world trying to reshape Christians today? And how can we guard against that?
The academia, universities like Harvard and Yale, they're teaching their students to stay away from Christianity. They're discriminating against the Jews, and they're indoctrinating them in classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
To stay away from the Christian faith.
Mm-hmm.
The subtle way of just twisting what Jesus says, or I think what I'm seeing lately is whenever politicians want to bring the Bible into political discourse, and how easily it just becomes a tool to get, to reframe things in some kind of biblical way, and then say, see, Christians, you should, do what your Bible says and do this, but you can take anything out of context and justify, pretty much anything. You can probably find a verse out of context to justify that. Just a comment, if a church is trying to be relevant and please the people, then it's going to necessarily try to be hip or cool to whatever the culture is doing, and so there's oftentimes compromise that happens there, and it's just a constant kind of a battle and assault to get Christians to compromise what they believe, or shift it a little bit, or want to fit in, or get approval from people, and just the Bible's not super popular, so it's easy to fall into that temptation, want to change.
Yeah.
Steve, to answer the second question, how do we guard against them? I think it goes back to the Christian home, the parents. If they teach their offspring the correct, the true Christian faith, these kids who go to school wouldn't be swayed by the professors who are leaning against Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And one practical example as far as the government is concerned is guarding against them is like Harvard and Yale, the government is withholding the financial aid to these institutions because they're siding against Christians and the Jews.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that about the home, because that's where we're heading here. Well, we can imagine with all this going on, Daniel and his friends were really in a whirlwind. They were taken captive. They were taken on this 900-mile, 4-month march to a foreign land. As we saw last week, they entered Babylon through this imposing, intimidating Ishtar Gate. Then they found out that they would receive the best education Babylon had to offer and eat the same food the king was eating. It was a traumatic time, but in one sense, it also held promise for them personally. They were not lured in by the beauty of their new surroundings. Verse 8 is one of the most important verses in all of Scripture. Newer translations like the ESV, the NIV, New American Standard, even the Revised Version, they render the beginning of this verse, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself, or Daniel resolved in his heart, or Daniel purposed in his heart. We see that the King James Version used that older language, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Well, there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, Daniel is mentioned by name, but we soon understand that the other three young men are of the same mind with Daniel. This is interesting when we consider the spiritual condition of Judah at that time. Remember how we read about how all the kings had become so corrupted and the priesthood had become corrupted? They had erected altars of false gods of the surrounding nations. They were sacrificing on those altars. They didn't take down the high places that God had commanded them. The kings were corrupt and the priests were corrupt. So, where did these young men obtain the knowledge of God's law and the determination to obey it? Well, it was from their parents. They were faithful to obey the words of the Shema in Deuteronomy 6 through 9. Did I hand that one out? Okay.
And these words I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and you shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates.
These young men's parents had done this. They had taught them this law and bathed them in that, if you will. So God preserved a faithful remnant in the midst of this perverse generation. And actually, it was through many perverse generations, as we saw in those waning years of the kingdom of Judah as things got worse and worse. As God is bringing judgment on the nation of Judah, his chosen people, we see he still displays mercy. He kept a remnant to be faithful to his name and to his law. The parents don't receive any recognition here, but we see the fruit of their efforts displayed in the character of their sons. Well, what was Daniel's conviction? What was he purposing to do? It says it was to not defile himself. The Babylonians could change his name, but they could not change his character. His response was like that of Moses. It was one of faith. We read about that in Hebrews 11, 24 to 26.
By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward.
So in some ways similar to Moses, Moses was in the king's palace, and Daniel's in the king's palace too. And he has this opportunity to be not a co-ruler, but some kind of authority or official in the kingdom. He has that set before him. But he doesn't want to defile himself with the king's food. What was wrong with the king's food? Well, we're not told specifically, but it may be that the food had been sacrificed to idols, and Daniel felt this was a compromise he could not make. Some have suggested that maybe Daniel may have taken a Nazirite vow, and therefore partaking of the food he was offered in the king's court would have broken the vow. Whatever the reason, it was clear that in Daniel's mind that this was a compromise he could not make. Well, we're going to go on next week from this point. We're kind of leaving it hanging a little bit here. But this was a good break point to get this initial idea in of Daniel purposing in his heart, and we'll see how that works out in the rest of this chapter next week. So I've got one picture for you this week. This is by James Tissot, painted around the turn of the century, the 20th century. It's called The Flight of the Prisoners, and this is his idea of what it was like for the Jews as they were being led out of Jerusalem by the Babylonian guards. And then just a couple of application questions. So what do we see about God in our passage tonight?
He's looking for people to be faithful to him regardless of the situation.
Yeah.
God has been sovereign over the kings and the nations, and the rise and fall of them. And he's willing to bring judgment against Judah, so it's he can play favorites if he wants to, but he does and he doesn't, because he's shown them that if you disobey my commands, here's the consequences of that. So he's not impartial.
That's not to say that Babylon is off the hook.
Yeah.
We're going to find that out too before long. Yeah.
There's going to be a kind of a consistency. Sin must go punished, and he can show grace and mercy, but we know that it comes at a cost. Ultimately, Christ has to bear the price of sin. So no sin goes unpunished, and he gets punished in there.
Lesson learned is, again, if one's prophets the truth, acts the truth, good and righteous intention, the Lord will back up that person.
Well, and how about one more? In what ways can we see Daniel's actions as a model for how we can live faithfully in a world that is different from our own?
It's good to have resolutions, I think. And even, like Jonathan Edwards, very famously said 70 resolutions he made as a young man. And he's even in a quasi-Christian environment, so to speak, early America. There's a lot of cultural Christianity, but he still wanted to make resolutions that really took his Christianity seriously. And I think it's not a bad idea just to think about or even write out, well, what are some resolutions I have or some convictions, just to put some real specificity or practicality to how I live my life, especially now since it's not exactly Christian culture anymore. Maybe even more relevant to just think about where you stand and what things you believe are necessary. It sounds kind of silly now, but I don't ever want to say give like an AI sermon, and that's not like I've written that down anywhere as a resolution, but just a purpose in my heart. All that stuff is nice, Google is nice and all these things, but just a purpose that I'm going to give people something, really from me that I've chewed over or cultivated. I think I owe that to people and I owe that to the Lord. So just things like that, I don't know.
Daniel's action is a characteristic that he's got wisdom or an acute mental discernment of what is right and what is wrong. I said it last time, The word is sagacity, mental discernment of knowing what is right and what is wrong. And if it's right, stand by it. And the Lord will guide us, or will guide you. And I wish I had sagacity when I was his age.
Yeah.
You kind of notice his convictions that, well, let's see how close to the line I can get, or let's see just, you know what I mean? Just like a mentality we can have sometimes. Well, you know, I'll go all the way up until it's clearly sin. But I think maybe there was some food that would have been okay, but he just says, look, just give us, vegetables and water.
Right.
Just to not like even toy around with it. And just from practice, it's like, in this day and age, everything's so gray, and there's a lot of like gray areas, and I can imagine, and I'm not saying it's to judge everyone where they land on a great matter, but there's something about just him as a young man, just like, we're not gonna have any of the king's food, because I know, I can't imagine all of it's bad, but just vegetables and water.
No spoilers.
Yeah, no spoilers, I'm sorry. For 6 verses ahead, but sorry, spoiler.
Yeah. I think one thing that hit me more this time going through this is, so often we talk about how terrible things were for them, right? They're getting ripped away from their home. They traveled 900 miles away, but they're not being beaten, right? They're not making bricks with their feet like they were in Egypt. They're going to be given the best education possible at the time. They're eating the same food as the king of the empire is eating.
Yeah.
This is a pretty good gig, right? Yes, you miss your mom and dad. Yes, you miss your home. But when you're 15 years old, you can forget about that pretty easily, and think about all the good things that are ahead of you. And there had to be some of that kind of influence on them, just to thinking, yeah, this is different, and there are things I don't like about it, but wow, there's some opportunity here. I'm going to have a good life. And they said no to that too.
There is a difference between the teenagers at Daniel's times and teenagers nowadays.
Well, there wasn't such a thing.
Snowflakes.
I mean, yes, people were the age of teenagers, but this whole idea of being a teenager as we know it, I mean, you were either a child or you became a man, and there really wasn't that kind of period in between there, but yeah. Okay, anything else before we close?